Hey, and welcome back to Speak About the Spark, brought to you by Createschool.ie. Every fortnight in this podcast, we talk to somebody from the field of creative arts, gaining an insight into their process and find out what sparks their creativity. If you'd like to get in touch with suggestions and thoughts, please find us at Createschool on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube and Instagram, or email us at info@createschool.ie. For links to the guests and their work or anything else mentioned in this series, go to createschool.ie/spark. My name is Justin, and in this week's episode, I interview Peter Murphy. Peter Murphy is a freelance journalist for Hot Press magazine. He's a spoken word artist, he's a musician, he's a novelist. Peter talks to us about his creative process, coming unstuck, and what it's like to teach writing. He also talks about how it's important to have a morning routine and how physical exercise is great for creativity. I really enjoyed sitting down with Peter. Hope you enjoy it too. Peter Murphy, welcome.
Good to be here.
Can you tell us a bit about yourself, who you are?
I'm a mongrel creature who has lived several different existences. Mostly I'm a writer. I've written 2 novels. Working on a book of short stories at the moment. For many years I was a journalist. I started off as a drummer in a band with the institution that is Mick Egan in the late 80s. So I always wrote. I was obsessed with comics when I was a kid, and that was kind of my into reading. I came from a family of readers. My mother and father were kind of obsessive readers of books and newspapers. So I always wrote for school when it was basically a job of work. You were given to do essays or whatever. But the first kind of obsessional reading was horror stories, supernatural stuff, comics, 2000 AD, Star-Lord, sci-fi, genre stuff mainly. Stephen King was the first obsessive reading that I did. I read pretty much everything he wrote in the first half of the 80s as it came out. But music was always there alongside it. My mother threw out the television when I was about 8. So the only options left were to sort of creep into the crypt of the Big Brother's room and look at these strange alien beings on the cover of the records. So that and the radio, Radio Luxembourg, and kind of indiscriminate listening. Nighttime radio, particularly at the time in the late 70s, was a sort of banana republic where anything went, whether it was Dave Fanning Show or John Peel or anything after dark. You could hear anything being played. Yeah. It wasn't as strictly controlled as it is now. So around about when I was 16, I just had this awful urge to play. I sort of taught myself the drums on a sort of hardback book, 2 rulers and my mother's sewing machine pedal. And just played along to records. I was kind of self-taught. I was always a mediocre drummer. I was never particularly gifted, but I liked playing the songs rather than the instrument. Drums as well? Occasionally, yeah. I have been playing a little bit recording recently. We'll come to that in a minute. But I went from that then I played in bands for about 9 years. Loads of different bands. Moved up to Dublin in 91. Played in about 3 or 4 bands up there. Band called the Tulips, band called Grasshopper. We released a couple of singles, but then the necessities of paying the rent bit hard, and I figured I didn't want to be a kitchen porter for the rest of my life, so I just started submitting reviews to magazines and papers. Got a little bit of freelance work, and then I started sending reviews to Hot Press, and the more stuff I sent them, the more they used, and over the period of about a year and a half, I just became one of their regular contributors. Mm-hmm. So I was with them for about 15 years. We're about 10 years in, I started to get this itch that the fidelity to the facts of journalism, and in many cases you're kind of prescribed what to write about. Okay. We had a lot of freedom in Hot Press in those days. You could propose, here, look, Lydia Lunch has a record out, she's fascinating, can I talk to her? And Liam Mackey, who was my editor at the time, was always kind of open and would say, yeah, it was sort of like one for us and one for them. They'd be like, yeah, you can have this, but you got to go interview some junior minister in the morning.
Yeah.
That was great in terms of like life experience, and I never went to college, so it was a proper education, and just in terms of being a little more assured of myself in terms of the range of people I could talk to. It took away a lot of shyness or insecurity or whatever.
Okay.
Through the lens of the job, I learned how to talk to different kinds of people.
And what kind of who did you interview?
It would be everyone. Like, it would go everything from kind of F.W. de Klerk, the ex-president of South Africa, to Lou Reed, to P.J. Harvey, to Sonic Youth, then loads of writers.
Wow.
William Gibson, the sci-fi, the cyberpunk grandfather, James Ellroy, the crime kingpin, and a lot of non-fiction writers. And then a lot of media people, broadcasters, Donald Deneen, John Kelly, all those guys. So it was a sort of 360-degree education.
And you find that these people you spoke to, they've influenced like your approach or your output?
It would, yeah. Well, it was such a privileged position to be in, to actually sit in a room with people and just have a license to pick their brains.
Yeah.
The sort of thing you'd usually get arrested for in a bar.
Kind of like what I'm doing now.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, podcasting is interesting because it's very similar to what we used to do, which was the long form interview.
Yeah.
There was a time when if somebody gave us interview time and it was under 45 minutes, we'd say, forget it.
Yeah.
You're only just drinking your coffee and breaking the surface at that point. It was interesting towards, around about 2010, 2011, you'd start to get these dictates handed down from the record company. You've got 12 minutes on the phone with some guy from Pearl Jam, and you'd be like, what am I supposed to do with that? It was economics, though. They couldn't afford to do press tours anymore, or they could afford it, but a lot of people couldn't afford to be going on press junkets that were extremely expensive, flying people across from the States or up from Spain or wherever it was. But yeah, it all fed back into, I still remember conversations I had with particular people. I still remember lines that certain people have said to me, whether it be Wim Wenders, the film director, or Bruce Robinson, who wrote With Nail and I, larger than life characters. But it kind of, and sustained some friendships out of it as well. Without dropping names or anything, but people like James Dean Bradfield from the Manic Street Preachers, when the first book came out, we had an interesting exchange because I picked up the phone to interview him for a journal for Plague Lovers, that album. And he said, look, I don't care if you hit the record, but I really like your book, which is nice. And, people like Butch Vig or Shirley from Garbage, who I wouldn't be like in constant contact, but we'd be... We're at a strange place now where it's like I've known them for 20 years. Yeah. There's no kind of strangeness there. Wow. And they're fascinating just in terms of basic kind of work practices, Did
I hear you saw a copy of one of your books in a film?
It was in one of the extra DVD extras for Nick Cave's film 20,000 Days on Earth.
Wow, that's a great movie.
Yeah. Which is an amazing movie about creativity.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And work practices and therapeutic stuff. Yeah.
It's rare you get to see somebody actually in that process of making music in their home.
Yeah, it was an interesting film because a lot of the scenes were kind of staged and yet they were real at the same time. Yeah,
I love that part where he's driving and he's got different people in the
back of the car. Yeah,
amazing,
Kylie and Blixa Bargeld and Ray Winston. Like, who else would know such a realm of acquaintances? But I was just looking at There was a sort of extra on the DVD or something. I was watching it one day, and it was about the sort of how they kind of constructed simulacrum of his office on a set, and they were looking at, the set designer was talking about the things that he picked from the actual office and wanted to. And there was a pile of books there, and I was sort of like, oh, I wonder what's on the next desk. And there at the bottom of the pile was John the Revelator.
That's brilliant. Wow. That must have been a good feeling, like to see that.
Well, I knew he had it. Sinead Gleason told me that she'd given him a copy of it a few years later, and she met him. She met him later on, and my name came up, and she said, "Did you ever read that?" And he said, "Does that begin with a storm?" And she said, "Yeah." He said, "Yeah, I started it, but I never got to finish it because Warren Ellis stole it." And then he passed it on to Thomas Weidler, and it was basically going around the bad seeds. I don't think Nick ever read it.
So, all these different projects that you've written for, like journalism, you write spoken words.
Yeah, the performance is the
novels.
that's the most latest sort of aspect of it.
How long are you doing that then?
About 7 or 8 years, I'd say.
So it's relatively young.
Well, it came. I always had an itch to do it, but I never knew like how is this supposed to come out. I often felt kind of frustrated as a mediocre drummer with this urge to kind of communicate to the audience, but I wasn't a songwriter or a singer. So I didn't have that direct sort of conduit. And it would often sometimes frustrate me when the singer in the band wouldn't talk to the audience or make eye contact with them or actually perform. Because I always loved it as a fan and as a punter, as a journalist, I always really respected when people performed, put on a show.
Yeah.
A certain amount of theatricality. I mean, I grew up loving Bowie and Tom Waits and Kate Bush and all these people. So that came out of shortly before the first book was published, John the Revelator. Acco from Enniscorthy, an old friend of mine who I'd known since we were 14 or 15 and had played in a couple of bands with, he had an open mic night happening in the Bailey up in Enniscorthy, and I think for the first time I just read a passage from it, and afterwards he said, I can't remember which one of us said, shall we record some of this? So he just basically came around to my house in Enniscorthy where I was at the time with a laptop, and over the course of the winter we just recorded these readings from the book, and he would bring them back to his lair and kind of score them, set them to music. Yeah. So we kind of made a record by accident. We had an album's worth, and Jerry Fish at the time was doing a lot of recording of spoken word for a project that I was doing based on Michael Madsen, the actor who was in Reservoir Dogs, his poetry. And Jerry had managed to get people like Willie Nelson and Iggy Pop and some incredible stuff. So I knew he was interested in that realm. And I'd known Jerry through interviews and socially as well. So, Jerry came down one day and sat in the car with me and Acco, and we played the whole thing from start to finish. And he said, like, lads, this is good enough to put it, like, I'd like to put it out. So incredibly generously, he put it out on his label. I mean, it's highly kind of, I really like it. It reminds me of old radio plays or something. It's not a perfect record by any means, but there's a lot of interesting stuff on it, and but it's a lot less niche now than it was at the time. Totally, yeah. So when I wrote the second book, Shall We Gather at the River, myself and Acco and Paula Cox were actually scoring the readings almost as they were being written. So that was a much more fully realised kind of
performance
record.
Type.
Yeah. So the record was called The Brotherhood of the Flood, and the live show just kind of expanded.
Came from that. Okay.
Yeah. And that kind of reached. I remember the last few gigs we did, and I remember really having this feeling of like, this thing has kind of gone as far as it can in a really good way in terms of using backing tapes and a slightly theatrical performance. And I remember thinking, this is exactly what I had envisioned building. But that came to a natural end. And since then, 2 years ago, I went and poached your guitarist, Dan Comerford. Well, I didn't poach him, but I borrowed him. And as you know, Dan has an incredible sort of range of styles, going from sort of orthodox songwriting or collaborating, great singer, but brilliant with technology. But what and Dan had done a little bit of work for Paula Cox, so I remember seeing how adept he was with technology and kind of soundscapes and stuff beyond kind of songwriting.
Yeah, totally. He's good for he's got a really nice his guitar tones and his way of approaching playing the guitar even is it's kind of very expressive,
Yeah, and intuitive.
Yeah, and he loves all the little gadgets as well.
Yeah, he's a total tech geek.
Yeah, he is.
Much like yourself. But I kind of wanted to stage a first show under the name Cursed Murphy. I wanted a sort of a new chapter. I chose the name Cursed Murphy because if you Google Peter Murphy, you'll find the old kind of goth singer from Bauhaus from the 80s. So to avoid confusion, I figured I'd better invent a stage name. So Cursed Murphy was born. So since then, it's been on and off. Me and Dan built a set over 6 weeks and put on a couple of shows. And then when I was staging these kind of multidisciplinary events, Cursed Murphy's Laboratory in the Arts Centre, and the final one, I asked Rebecca Gagnes, who has like a drum crew who use kind of warlike Brazilian rhythms. They're a samba band as well, but they have all these other sides to their playing that doesn't often get heard in a sort of a parade kind of context. So I had this track, Burn Hibernia Burn, which I always envisioned as a sort of Public Enemy type thing. And I got the crew in Rebecca, Tamara, Yasmin Gagnes and Kevin Dillon, and together with Dan we just rehearsed one piece to do with the laboratory, but we had a ball and they created an incredible ruckus. So
it was very thundering.
And it kind of opened out a side that I'd never been able to investigate, because I'm a total sort of primitive punk rock geek as well. Like, the Stooges Funhouse would be one of my favourite records. So it kind of pushed it out of spoken word and allowed me to sort of almost be like a vocalist, but not really a vocalist or a performer, more sort of. One of my favourite records is Lou Reed's New York record, and the whole thing is basically spoken. It's basically storytelling. Caught between the twisted stars, the plotted lines, the faulty map that brought Columbus to New York. Like the Register is not much beyond that. I love the Velvet Underground and stuff, and Sonic Youth, and so that kind of gave us scope to open it out into a bigger thing. So that's been the last 8 years. So we're making a record at the moment.
You're recording down at Johnny Fox's.
Which is great. I mean, everybody has other stuff that they do. And as do I. I've got the writing and I've got plenty of other stuff on the boil. So it's not as claustrophobic as a kind of a band situation where everybody's like really intensely dependent on this one thing. It's much more fluid. People can come and go or drop out. I mean, we've had a stable lineup, thanks be to God, and it's been amazing that everybody's so into it. But there's a kind of security in not being too angst-ridden or uptight, and Dan obviously is Frankenstein Bolts, and he's a brilliant songwriter himself, and he's got a ton of stuff that goes on. I can do shows on my own. I did a few shows in Sweden last year that were amazing fun. Trying to carry a whole show on your own with just the voice is quite a challenge. Or we can do scaled down versions of it for smaller rooms. So I like that kind of amorphous.
Yep, I get that totally.
Yeah.
And then writing for the spoken word thing, or writing a novel.
Yeah.
What's the difference in your approach there? Is there Do you sit down, set a time aside to do these things, or do they kind of, evolve with you over time? Or do you decide, right, I'm going to write a novel now, or I'm going to write a poem now, I'm going to write a spoken word piece?
Pretty much. I mean, I find you get into trouble when you don't know basically what you're doing.
Yeah.
Without being too prescriptive. Sometimes stuff, as you know, stuff flies out of the ether and you don't know what it is yet.
Yeah.
It's best while it's gestating not to try and put it in a confirmation suit or anything. But generally, I know they're different disciplines. Discipline being the word. When I'm writing, one of the things that journalism taught me was basically the value of a deadline. And also a certain amount of, not necessarily cavalier, but not being too precious about the process and just showing up. When there's 1,200 words due in the morning, you just show up and you do it, you get it done, because then the rent doesn't get paid. Yeah. And a certain amount of that, C.S. Lewis once said that the muse is most likely to come visiting when you're sitting at your desk working. And there seems to be no way around that. I generally have to show up every morning and put in a few hours. Now, sometimes you might get a good day's work done in an hour, and sometimes it's like pushing a boulder up a hill. Yeah. And the key is knowing when to leave it.
That's what I was going to ask. Do you think there's a stage there during those few hours that you're pushing the boulder up the hill that you should just walk away from it?
Sometimes. Yeah.
How much labouring should you do?
It's like, how long is a piece of string? Yeah. I don't know. It's an ongoing bugbear with me. Yeah. The deal is, the pact is show up anyway. Yeah. Show up for work on time. Dressed for work. Get out of your dressing gown. And there's a great book called Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. I'm not a big fan of her other work, but this is an amazing book about creativity. And she says, like, you dress for work as if you're going on a date. Yeah. Because it just means, like, you're going on a date with the muse, so show up, believing you mean business. Yeah. It's a sort of commitment to the work at hand. I always love that about Tinder Sticks or the Bad Seeds or Bowie. Yeah. You look at them on a rehearsal day, and even if they're dressed casually, they just look like they're serious people. Yeah. They've got a sharp edge to them. They do, yeah. They're not showing up in Bermudas and a pair of flip-flops.
Do you know what that book was that you're talking about?
Big Magic.
Big Magic.
Yeah. Okay. And there's another book on writing by Stephen King. Is a hugely valuable book, whether you're a fan of his work or not. And I haven't read anything new that he's done in about 20 or 30 years, but it is one of the most unpretentious, practical books about writing. I'd recommend it to any artist. Okay. And there's another book called The Conversations, which is an interview book. The interviews were conducted by Michael Ondaatje, the great Canadian novelist and poet. He wrote The English Patient. And the subject of the book is Walter Murch, who's a film editor and sound designer on Apocalypse Now, The Godfather, The Conversations, The English Patient, Cold Mountain. He's basically a master. But that is one of the greatest books about creativity I've ever read, because Murch is just this polymath. He's a genius who will, he'll apply the principles of Italian Renaissance poetry construction to how to cut a scene. And extremely interesting for any musician, because the sound design, obviously, some of the sounds that he's created are iconic. Like, there's an amazing passage in it where he talks about the famous segue from Martin Sheen in the hotel room, and he's looking at the spinning blades of the fan overhead into the helicopters. That was a complete accidental cut. He had two different scenes set up on the monitor. Almost a eureka moment where he looked from one monitor with the spinning blades of the fan to the other monitor with the spinning blades of the choppers, and just went, oh my God.
We have to do this,
Yeah.
Excellent.
So in terms, work, you got to show up for work and you got to have structure.
Yeah.
Structure is key.
And a deadline is important.
And a deadline.
Yeah.
If only arbitrary.
Yeah.
You know, you can always blow a deadline.
Yeah.
You know, and this is one thing. I suppose we should talk about getting stuck.
Yeah.
You can take your work regime to kind of neurotic lengths, and if you find that you're leaning on it as a human being, but not for the work, it can get into trudgy territory, get tedious. I showed up in the library. I used to go into the library here in Wexford every morning as soon as it opened, and I would stay there till 4 in the afternoon. And there was a period around about 2014, 2015 where I literally was kind of overloaded with ideas and did not know what I was doing. I'd keep starting what I thought were novels, and it transpired they were not novels. And by process of elimination, I discovered I was writing a book of short stories.
Okay.
Which I was kind of resistant to because publishers hate them, and it's kind of career suicide. Yeah. But that sense of ungratefulness, I think, was a real lesson because it generated nothing, only angst and counterproductivity.
You think you can have too many ideas?
I think you can, yeah.
It's almost as crippling as having no ideas at all, you know.
Like my only antidote for that is keep a big book, put the ideas in them, and the ideas will stay fresh if you just put down the paragraph, whatever it is, even just a general outline, but pick one and stick to it and finish it.
Okay. And do you find that with books of ideas that you do go and revisit them when you need something to work at, or you're always working on something that's fresh in your mind?
Generally, I think once the act of putting them down in the book keeps them in the head, and they're generally, intuitively, they'll come back to you at the right time when you're ready for them.
Okay.
I have literally written the same passage over the space of 15 years, thinking I was writing a new idea every time, only to realise I've written an identical one, a long time ago. But in many ways, I think the subjects people choose are recurring obsessions in their life. They're almost like riddles that can't be solved. And you kind of pray that you never solve them, because then you'll kill it stone dead. You know, if you do a perfect work of art, it's dead. There it is. That idea is done. You have a little funeral for it. But one of the things, if it gets difficult, I mean, everybody goes through periods where they're dry or just bereft of ideas. And it's a weird balance. Like, you shouldn't give up on work just because it's hard. But at the same time, you need to know when to stop banging your head off the wall. I mean, Einstein famously described madness as repeating the same activity and expecting different results. So, and I recognize that feeling. It's a sort of fatigue, not unlike a sort of spiritual hangover. And a lot of sighing and a lot of moaning and a lot of complaining and a lot of one big kind of clench. It's the opposite of freedom. It's the opposite of being fluid.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I generally find during those periods I'm not reading enough.
Okay.
I'm not listening to enough music. I'm not watching enough movies. I'm not going to enough plays. You have to let the bucket fill up.
That's I was just going to ask about, do you know why people, do you have any idea why people get stuck? But I find that myself, it's because I'm not doing enough listening and reading and watching. And eventually it does clear, you know, it comes back around. And when it does, it's a good feeling, you know.
It's like, you know, the first day you get a gusher after the drought. It's like, thank God, I thought I was dead.
And it's as well, what I find with a dry spell, and sometimes dry spells can last a long time, you know, it can last months, and for me anyway.
Sometimes years.
Yeah, years, yeah.
I've gotten work over a period of years that's worth keeping, but it's not. It's not fluid.
Totally, and even when I listen back to songs I've written, I know the songs that I was putting out while I was going through these spells of kind of being stuck, I suppose.
Yeah.
But I think the one thing that gets me is when a dry spell does come along, I think to myself, oh no, is this it?
Yeah.
Was the last song I wrote that I liked the last song I'm ever going to write?
Yeah.
So it's nice to hear that. It is only a temporary thing, and it is to do with what you're doing at the time, or what you're kind of, I suppose putting in.
I think one useful trick is to use reverse psychology on it and go, okay, forget it then. Okay, I don't have to do this. Yeah. There's a danger in defining yourself as a musician or a writer, or defining yourself by any activity is kind of is a bit dodgy, because it stops you from growing. Where you're like, I'm an actor, I don't write. But if you flip it, I think, and you go, okay, say it is done. Okay, go find something else to do.
Yeah.
Or try and actively suppress it then. Every time you get up to, you have the compulsion to go and write something, say, oh, no, stop it.
Yeah.
Don't do it. And eventually, I think, the creative resistance to that doing nothing becomes so great that it actually becomes kind of inspiring. I once asked Neil Gaiman, who's incredibly prolific. He's just like a wellspring of stories, from graphic novels, from Sandman through to Coraline to American Gods. He never seems to question what he does. And I asked him once, how is that? You seem incredibly unquestioning of your own abilities. And he said, I get it the same as everyone else. But he said, here's what I do. I have a shed or a lodge at the bottom of the garden, or he did at the time I spoke to him. And he said, I go in there and I allow myself the option of doing nothing or writing. And he said, after about 20 minutes, the only thing that makes writing look good is being forced to do nothing. So there's that aspect. But also to remove the ego from it a little bit. The act of listening to other people's music or watching their movies or reading is a form of connecting you to a wider wellspring of ideas. It makes you at once humbler and more nourished, I think. And I remember hearing Keith Richards once say that he always considers that he doesn't write the songs or the music, that there's just this universal radio out there that's broadcasting, and he's just figuring out how to tune into it, or just tuning into it without even trying. And he said, and Keith, for all his sort of, father of Jack Sparrow sort of dissolution, I think is pretty wise in terms of creativity. He's a phenomenal guitar player. I love to hear him talk about particularly old blues recordings. He's very eloquent on it. But I thought that was quite a sane and sophisticated idea, that it bypasses the ego. So it's not coming out of you. Therefore it's not a reflection on you. So you can't take the credit for it, nor will you take the disgrace for it if it stinks.
That's a good way of looking at it.
It just removes you from the equation, and you just view yourself as a conduit.
Just wanted to ask you as well then about technology. Do you use anything to record your ideas on, or is it all pen to paper kind of recording? It's
kind of the fourth wall that I have to break through. I know from looking at Dan at work, looking at Ian Doyle at work, or Killian and Lorcan from Baskerville, how adept they've become. It's long overdue that I actually become more adept with technology than I am. I've always had a bit of a block about it. I managed to get away without having to learn the basics of it. Johnny Fox is another genius with that. I mean, he built his own studio. Johnny, who's sort of recording, co-producing and engineering the record that we're working on at the moment. Writing is kind of anti-technological by nature, and I often tell students that, turn off the Wi-Fi, it's kryptonite. and you cannot be in the same room as the internet. It's kind of like you're lying on a bed and there's this succubus sitting on your chest, sucking the breath out of you. Like, it is extremely difficult to focus, and it's quite interesting, I think, what's happened to the human brain over the last 10 or 15 years, as in everybody talks about the reduced attention span. And now, I don't think there's any return to the days of the 600-page Victorian novel that takes 8 pages to describe somebody's fireplace. But at the same time, both the act of reading and writing and any form of creativity requires focus and calm. I always think of it as sort of like going down in a diving bell, an old-fashioned one where it takes like an hour to suit up, and then you got to spend like 20 minutes getting lowered in. And if somebody starts pulling on the rope while you're down there, and you get pulled out of it, you're going to have to start all over again. It's kind of like that.
That's a good analogy. Yeah.
So I try and keep the technology away. I'm actually regressing in terms of technology for writing. I used to, I started writing on an electric typewriter, I think, in the 90s. And then in terms of practicality, when email came in, the idea that you could email your copy into the office, rather than trudging into town with a floppy disk, giving it to the typesetter. This is miraculous. Your productivity. And then when you'd be going away on junkets and, going to interview Metallica in Berlin or something, the idea that you could bring your laptop with you, transcribe the interview when you got back to the hotel, clean it up, and maybe file the feature the next morning as you're waiting in the airport was unbelievable. Of course, the downside of that now is people are never off duty. So that one kind of can backfire and bite you in the butt.
When ideas come to you, then if you're just out and about in the day, do you have some way of getting them down, or do you just keep that in your
analog baby? It's the notebook.
You got the notebook.
It's the notebook. Always paper. There's something about the act of your own handwriting.
Totally, that physical.
So then when you type it up, you've already gone into another draft, and that's different.
Yeah, the editing, I suppose, options on software, and I do use, say, if my phone, if something comes in, I use the voice recorder on my phone. But I don't use the phone to type down, write down lyrics and things like that. I find the editing options are just, I'm constantly deleting the same set of words over and over, trying to do everything in the first draft, I suppose, rather than once it's down on, I don't have pencils with erasers on top of them or anything like that. Just, and then later on you get into, you're right, once you get home, then you try to write, you write it out again.
I think this is a really important point, actually, which is, I think one of the reasons it takes me a few years to write a novel, usually, and I think it comes out of having learned to write with a word processing program. It's my life's work to try and wean my way back to a handwritten first draft. What that forces you to do is write the first draft, the old screenwriting adage, write the first draft and then learn to forgive yourself. It's write it in all its lumpy, warts and all, flawed, overwritten, underwritten glory, but get the first draft down before engaging the monkey brain. The monkey brain will basically talk you out of anything. The monkey brain is just this idiot, drooling, jeering big brother, back of the class smart aleck who, I always hear him in a broad Wexford accent going, "Who do you think you are, son? Come on. What are you doing? Go and get a job."
What's wrong with you?
What's wrong with you? You and Owen Colfer once said, the most devastating thing he ever heard was, well, maybe not devastating, but the most typically Wexfordian thing he ever heard was walking down the main street one day and hearing a voice from a doorway going, "There goes your man with his books." There's an element to that. That's the monkey voice. And a lot of my, when I've given classes in creative writing is to say, and this comes up in Elizabeth Gilbert's book, like, he's kind of like your father-in-law or annoying cousin who, like, you're going on holiday, right? He has to come with you.
Yeah.
You're going to have to figure out how to integrate him into the structure. But he or she sits in the back, basically, while you're driving, telling you you're going too fast or too slow, or you missed a turn off or whatever. And you have to turn around and go, look, buddy, you can stay in the car. Okay, you're part of the family. I get it. You're coming with us, but you're not driving. So let him have his way, like on the second or third draft. Yeah. And a little bit of that voice is good. Yeah. Sometimes a lot of that voice is good. You can't be too in love with your own work. Yeah. But it has no place in the first draft. Because you can't edit and write at the same time. You'll end up with nothing.
Yeah, totally agree with that. Yeah, great. The monkey brain.
The monkey brain. Yeah.
We'll watch out for him. I know him.
Oh,
he lives in my house as well.
And it's not just us. It's carpenters have it when they're making a table. Yeah,
it's that self critic, that self doubt.
Yeah.
So you were saying earlier on. I just have a couple more questions for you. You were saying earlier on that you write in the morning time.
Yeah.
So you get out of your dressing gown and you show up for work.
Where possible, yeah. I try and write for a couple hours and then exercise and then go back in.
Okay. And do you think even the exercising, is that
crucial?
Yeah.
It was a life changer for me.
Yeah.
I didn't exercise. I mean, I trained a bit when I was younger because I came from a boxing family and there was a local boxing club. And they're not dissimilar, actually. Mm-hmm. I often suggest to writing students that they think of it less like alchemy or creating a Michelangelo work of art, more like training. Yeah. But both metaphorically and actually, the act of, I got back into just basic exercise, going for the odd run or cardio stuff or whatever, around about in my mid-40s. I have this personal theory that a lot of what people think is a midlife crisis is actually a drop in testosterone. For men, estrogen for women. It may affect women differently physically, but I believe psychologically we all go through the same bottleneck around about the same time. It may be to do with reproductive faculties in both sexes, but you actually lose, I think, 1 to 2% of testosterone every year from the age of 24 or 5. And it's very easily remedied. Like, it's cold showers, full fat butter, or exercise. But I think a lot of people get kind of tired and a bit despairing and a bit kind of mentally and physically out of shape at that time. And for me, it was a sense of kind of just getting a bit leaner mentally, a bit tougher. And the sense of this thing that you don't want to do, but you have to do it. Yeah. And you know it's good for you. It's a bit like a very fishwifey voice saying, I don't care if you want to do it or not. You're doing it because you're going to feel better afterwards. Yeah. And almost a bit the same way in the work is like redefining pleasure is when the pain stops.
And so you work out in between your writing,
I generally get up for a bit. I try to get up early. Yeah. In the summertime, I find it easier to be up around 6. Yeah. I need about a 45 minutes of not talking to anybody and drinking coffee, or generally just, some people meditate at that hour, or they write freehand in a journal, sort of throat clearing morning pages, they call it in the artist's way.
I've done the morning pages.
For me, I just sort of sit around and brood for about an hour. Then I'll go and take a look at what I'm working on. Might work for an hour and a half. Yeah. Get up, exercise, eat breakfast, and then go back in for another 3 or 4 hours or whatever I'm doing.
Because I do find like anything that I've ever kind of released, like has been written early in the morning, 6 o'clock, kind of getting up at 6. But I'm the opposite. I find it a lot easier to wake up at that time in the winter.
Right.
I like to sit in the dark because it's getting brighter in the summer, and I don't know, when it's bright, I find it easier to come out of that dream state, that, you know, that just woke up sort of state is where I like to write a lot of the time. Or, you know, so I think the winter for me, getting up early, it's harder obviously to get out of bed in the cold, but once you're up, I find it's still dark. I still haven't had any emails or anything, text messages coming through, any distractions like that. And just a pot of coffee, then sit there, you know, and write till it's bright, you know.
It's a kind of a holy time, all right? You feel like you're safe, you're in exile from the world. Yeah. Stuff hasn't started to come in at you yet. The first, John the Revelator, was written very early in the morning over a period of about 2 or 3 years, because the girls, my 3 daughters, were, they were, I think Grace was the youngest at the time, so she would have been about 5 or so, up to early teenage years, and they were of school going age, so there was, you know, loads of stuff flying around. Yeah. And I had the day job of journalism, deadlines that would not be disobeyed. Yeah. So I can remember vividly, I think it was shortly after my father died, it was that first intimation of time is not elastic. You know, there's an end. Yeah. And I wouldn't call it a panic, but it was more the sense of I would wake up at about 4 or half 4 going, what are you doing? Like, you're going to write about other people for the rest of your life? Yeah. Or you know, if you got to do something, you got to go now. And I had this sense of urgency for a couple of years. So I would get up on a good morning, I'd get up at about 4:30. And now some mornings I'd be typing with my nose, like, you know, just passed out. But most days the innings were good. 4 out of 6 days I'd get stuff done before they woke up at about 7:30 or 8. So, and I think that book has a sort of slightly dissociative dream state kind of thing going on with the narrator. He's not really attached to the world. So there's that liminal state where I'm sure Freud and Jung had loads of stuff on this, where you're kind of still covered in amniotic goop. You're just kind of, you're not really real yet, and stuff can come through. I think as no doubt you've discovered, that wouldn't otherwise come through. You're not really in self-censorship.
That's exactly, you're not censoring yourself at that time. You're too tired to do that.
Yeah.
Just last night I watched a live Facebook stream of you performing. Yeah. And the piece that I saw you do was you kind of talking to a politician or a minister. Yeah. Right. I love the line in it about, you know, how am I supposed to afford an iPad so my kid can do the junior cert? Yeah. You know? But then I know something like another piece, Foxhole Prayer. Yeah. What I found in those 2 pieces, even Foxhole Prayer, is a bit of a kind of a metaphor for like you list a lot of different things that are a foxhole prayer. Yeah. Right?
It could have gone for days.
Yeah. But the one I heard last night, to me, didn't have a lot of things like metaphors. It was a very straight to the bone type piece. Do you think, like, is there a bravery in writing that way and being very straight to the point? Is it is that something that you learned over the years, or does that come from maybe your journalism, something that you can be kind of honest and straight in your face that way about a topic, or is that something that you kind of think, right, well, this piece is going to be this way?
It took me a long time to get to that place. Okay. It came out of, I'd say, and it's an ongoing process, it came out of a series of concussions of, it came out of, like, the first one would have been my father's death. Mm-hmm. The second one would have been the end of my first marriage. Then my mother had dementia for several years. Then my second marriage imploded, and and then my brother died this year. It doesn't always have to be, I don't think it always has to be necessarily a trauma, but I think those comets, when they hit your earth, they're shocking and painful, but they also bring with it some form of release. Yeah. And for me, I think it's just been a gradual process of not caring anymore.
These events do chip away at that.
Yeah.
Thing, don't they? Yeah.
There's no... It's chipping away at the facade that you want to present to the world. And I found that my experience of each successive kind of life event, stuff that everybody goes through or will go through, I noticed how people responded was always shocked me as to how decent people were and how supportive they were, and how that a lot of the inner critic that I had in my head was of my own devising and sometimes reaches the level of self-sabotage or whatever. And I noticed with a lot of writers, like someone like Leonard Cohen, who was the king of it, just at a certain point just became weary of abstraction or symbolism and was just like, here's what I have to say.
Yeah.
You know, unvarnished. Here's what it is. A friend of mine, Rob Doyle, he's a writer. He called it. He was talking about this, the Norwegian writer Carlow College, who has written these incredibly kind of revealing books about his own life. Yeah. And Rob calls it the taking one for the team syndrome. Okay. It's like you're going to say something incredibly, it doesn't make you look good. Yeah. But everybody's going to feel it, and everybody's going to go, "Oh, I know what he's talking about." It's like so. A certain aspect of if you reach a level, not saying I'm there at all, but certain people like Dylan or Leonard Cohen or Kate Bush or whomever, or certain writers like Flannery O'Connor would have reached a level of not caring or going so beyond the ego that they'll take one for the team. Yeah. At its worst, that becomes self-indulgent, soul-bearing, journaling. Mm-hmm. That's not art. That's self-indulgence. Yeah. So it's a tricky one. You have to know at what point what you have to say. Your experience is universal, and at what point you should keep that one in the notebook.
Yeah, that's cool. So you just mentioned students earlier on there, and I just was going to just say that we were just talking before this. You were you were up in
the right
Carlow.
Residence in Carlow. Yeah,
that's right. And you do one-on-one.
Yeah.
So how much of this creative writing can be taught? How much do you think can it all be taught?
It's a good question. My thoughts are that, if you don't have a natural facility with ideas and language, nobody else can give it to you. They can't. Creative writing itself can't be taught. But the act of attending a creative writing module can give you structure. It can give you a boot camp sergeant or a therapist, whichever you prefer, to report to. It can give you deadlines. It can make you feel less alone. It can teach you certain techniques. You can certainly teach technique. You can't put the raw spirit into someone, but you can maybe teach them how to shape it or help them avoid certain pitfalls. If I see somebody's going down a rabbit hole with a certain diversion from their work that might be leading them to a bad place or leading them off track, you can read it and advise them and gently nudge them, or at least interrogate them on what they're doing. In some cases, I've attended screenwriting classes. I was part of a writers group when I was writing John the Revelator, which was unbelievable. Actually, it was the difference between me sitting in a attic writing and getting bogged down over and over again, and actually having a small audience, all of whom were writers themselves, who were in the same hole as you were, who were basically kind but smart and the kind of people who would tell you that your zipper was down.
It's a supportive thing as well,
yeah.
Because writing can be quite a lonely suppose, existence, you know.
Yeah.
It's definitely something, you know, the majority of the time you do it on your own, you know.
Yeah.
But I even found out with the open mic thing I was running for a couple of years, you know, regardless of your experience, there was a writing challenge handed out every week, and everyone went in on the same, like, nobody went in with it well rehearsed or anything like that, regardless of your experience. You know, people never wrote before were getting up in the same boat as somebody that was been writing for years, but it was always a new piece, so it was never kind of knowing how it was going to go down, you know. Yeah, I really enjoyed that, and I got a lot of songs out of that process, you know, and that support, I suppose, you know.
Well, the veteran feels maybe just even more under the cosh in that environment, because they have no excuse for churning out, you know. Of course, they have every excuse, but, you know, the expectations of them are higher, and everybody's first draft is a first draft, and nobody gets away light. Exactly. But yeah, I mean, like, I find cues, they're fun, but they're also good. I have certain techniques that I give people, which are just basically mechanical cues. You know, empty out your pockets and write me a story about something you found in.
Excellent.
Which comes from a great story called "The Things They Carry" by Tim O'Brien, who basically describes everyone in his unit in Vietnam according to the things that they put in their backpacks. So the guy who's a little more afraid of dying would carry more morphine. The guy who didn't give a damn would carry comic books. You know. Somebody would carry an extra, you know, wad of weed, and somebody else would carry letters from his girlfriend. So that's an amazing kind of exercise in character building through objects. So I love giving, and I learn, you know, like, let's be under no illusions. Anytime I'm giving a class, I'm listening to myself speaking, going, "Physician, heal thyself," you know. Go take some of your own advice, buddy, you know. That thing you said about 3-act structure, you're not really sticking to it, are you?
That's it. But even, like, when I get home evenings from doing workshops with Createschool, it's like, you know, why am I not writing at the moment? Like, why am I able to write this song at the moment? I just spent the whole day writing 3 or 4 songs with other people. You know, you need to start bringing those things home a little bit, and, you know, take your own advice and your own, you know, and try putting them into practice. I
kind of like working for other people. I always like commissions. I mean, I've been writing a lot separately from the short stories. I've been writing separate pieces for performance or for recording. So we've been on and off in the studio for a couple of months making this album, and the very act of having to show up, you know, and generally what happens is, like, it's kind of songwriting in reverse. I'd go in with a page of words and a rhythm idea, and I'd throw down the words first, and then maybe throw down some drums or a loop or something, and then Dan might come along later and kind of actually supply the tonal stuff, the chords. He actually colour in the music in between these outlines. But the act of knowing you're going to have to show up on Monday morning with these words tidied up is brilliant. But also, I mean, I was writing a sort of a prose poem, autobiographical prose poem, which I'd never done before, and I was struggling to find the structure for it. It's basically a life story, and the thing was too bloody big and unwieldy. But a writer called Catherine Dunn approached me with this idea structured around tarot cards. The idea being that she would assign a story to each card to different writers. But whether it gets used in that context or not, what it gave me was all of a sudden I started thinking of the span of a life through each card. So it gave me a structure to hang each piece on. Then all of a sudden the thing tidies itself up, and you know, and gives you an unusual structure. So, like, you know, as you know, with songwriting, there's limited notes on a scale. There's, I think, you know, drummers are the great unsung arrangers of the world, because literally they have to grid or if you're programming it yourself, you have to grid what you're doing. So by nature, it's going to put structure on it, which is not to, you know, I love Ornette Coleman as much as the next guy, but at certain hours of the day.
And when can we listen? I look forward to hearing your album then.
The album, are almost finished recording, so we're going to take our time to mix it over the summer. We'll probably put out a couple of tracks first over the autumn and maybe early next year. We're looking at the album release. As you know, making the record is easy. Scheduling it, manufacturing it,
all that stuff,
sorting out PR, and PR was never my strong suit in the past, but I'm kind of proud of what we're doing at the moment, and I want to give it its best shot. Now, the music industry or the arts in general being what they are today, you have to kind of have realistic expectations. But at the same time, I wanted to it's been proven that when we perform in front of people, there's an audience for it. It's actually quite accessible. So I want to give it its best shot in terms of finding its own audience. So probably early next year, I would say. And then hoping to have the short stories. They're being redrafted at the moment. They're going out to first readers, which is something I'd recommend anybody. If you're not still in a writers group, to have one or two readers whose taste you trust and depend on. That's
great,
the first listener, I'm sure you have it with demos or whatever, is like, who's the first person you play to outside the band?
I suppose I would send it to a couple of people. I send a lot of my music to Mick Egan.
Right.
With folks, actually, I often met them here, and even though I used to think that showing it to family members was you were never going to get an honest, because of their kind of, I suppose their biased opinion of you as a person,
Well, they say there's a reason why you shouldn't learn how to drive from a family member.
But I find that over the years they've come to know what I want in terms of a response when I send these things.
Yeah.
Well, Mick Egan, obviously Dan is probably the first person that gets it, because I kind of know then from Dan whether it's maybe something he thinks he would be interested in doing within the Frankenstein Bolts lineup that could we arrange it for our band that way, or would this be just something that I would keep for myself? And, but Dan is always a good guy to send things to.
I find Dan's response is actually very simple. Like, there's no judgment. He either responds to it musically or he doesn't. And generally, if he responds to it, you'll have something in 3 hours. Otherwise, it's like, and he has said to me on occasion, don't think I've got anything for this. But it would never be a case of I don't think this is any good, or it's not for me, or it's not my kind of thing. It's either there's an idea generated by it or not, which is kind of the same with a reader. The gesture I always remember from the studios, he would reach for a bass, not a guitar. He reaches for a bass. He just plucks the bass off the wall and starts fooling around. Next thing you know, you're recording it.
So we have an album and a book of short stories to look forward to.
That's the immediate. Those are the immediate projects, and they are very immediate. They're consuming pretty much all the oxygen.
Would you mind if we played a song at the end of this episode? Not from maybe you're new, but maybe something from the past if you're new.
Sure.
I know this is not going out for another, but you were saying you won't have the album till next year, so maybe something from the past.
We could use Foxhole Prayer. There's a couple of tracks off. I still off the record. I do kind of. The Revelator Orchestra kind of imploded. It couldn't go on, but it did kind of implode suddenly. But it meant that it kind of sucked the headwind out of that record that we made. There's a lot of stuff I can still listen to on that record. That's about my best way of saying I'm proud of it. There's a lot of stuff I can listen to without flinching on it.
Maybe we could include one of them.
There's a track called Isaac Miller that we do live still.
Brilliant.
But I can send it to you.
Excellent.
Or you'll find it on, I think it's on iTunes and stuff. But shout me when you're putting the tracks on, and I'll see what we've got.
Excellent. Okay. Peter Murphy, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Peter Murphy there. Great pleasure for me to sit down and talk to Peter about writing. You can tell that he's always writing, thinking about writing, and he's so interested in it. And I just really enjoyed the afternoon. Check out Cursed Murphy versus the Resistance. Catch them live; they're amazing. And keep an eye out for Peter's book of short stories. That's all for this week. Give us a shout on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and YouTube, or email us at info@createschool.ie if you have any suggestions or thoughts on the series. We're going to leave you now with a track from Cursed Murphy versus the Resistance called Foxhole Prayer. See you next time.
St. Peter, won't you hear this foxhole prayer? 6 or 7 beers, here comes the fear. A nightmare woke me. I was scared. I talked to God. God was not there. St. Peter, hear this foxhole prayer. Outside my door sounds like a war. They're hacking up the tarmac, shuttering the bars. Give me one more beer before the war's declared. Sweet Jesus, hear this foxhole prayer. Sweet Jesus, hear this foxhole prayer. But though I walk with ghosts, I know no fear, nor loss of heart, nor dark despair. We will endure, we'll get through this. This foxhole prayer says I exist. This foxhole prayer says I am sick of the sadness and the madness and all this apocalyptic shit. How sweet the sound that saved this wretch. How sweet the sound that saved this wretch. I swear it was a foxhole prayer. It was a foxhole prayer. Now the baby's first wail is a foxhole prayer. The salmon lamentation is a foxhole prayer. The toilet wall scrawl is a foxhole prayer. Rambo, Baudelaire, foxhole prayers. Parliament, Funkadelic, foxhole prayer. Nina singing Sinnerman, foxhole prayer. London calling is a foxhole prayer. Never mind the bollocks is a foxhole prayer. Fight the power is a foxhole prayer. People have the power is a foxhole prayer. John the Revelator was a foxhole prayer. Shall we gather at the river is a foxhole prayer. Put your head against the screen, tell me what you hear. 100,000 lost souls crying for an ear. 100,000 people singing foxhole prayers. 100,000 people singing foxhole prayers. Sweet Jesus, would you hear this foxhole prayer? St. Peter, won't you hear this foxhole prayer? This foxhole prayer says I exist. And what Samuel Beckett wrote at the end of The Unnameable might be the greatest of all foxhole prayers. He said, I